Jaime Lammers is what I go by socially. I am a gender specialized professional. I have a therapy degree and I provide gender specialized therapy, but I also provide my expertise in trainings, presentations, consultations, basically any way that individuals need the help. Because I am a transgender individual myself, I am female transgender, I go by the pronouns she, they, that I have the benefit of not only having the professional expertise, but the personal experience as well to understand this very crucial part of our life. And so I want to provide that to my community and to, well, the world as a whole. And that's where I kind of came to join you today about. I am one of the founders of Sheboygan County LGBTQ Alliance. Anybody who would be interested in helping our community become more affirming and more accepting and better our community, then I would ask that you please look into helping us in the Alliance. Anybody interested can always email me, or you can look us up on Facebook for that. Now I'm going to get started just by sharing my screen, and so that I want to make sure everybody can see. Everybody can see my screen right now?
Yep.
Awesome. So, to get started, today I was asked to come and talk to everybody about how to be affirming for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals within the workplace for a coworker perspective. This is something that I've been offering to employment individuals within my community as a part of one of our Alliance goals of making the employers of our community more understanding and accepting of LGBTQ individuals. I, as a gender specialist, of course, like to specialize in the gender if I can, but I really have the specialization of any LGBTQ as well. Just kind of as a note, so if anybody's wondering why I chose the background I did, the background for all the slides is the transgender pride flag. It is something that you can always use to show that you are supportive and accepting and understanding of transgender, gender nonconforming individuals. If you're looking for some sort of symbol to kind of show that. So let's just get right into this since we have a lot that I would like to talk about. The thing about gender is that we're going to, I'm doing kind of a 101 thing for you today. I could really talk probably for hours for any one of these slides. It is a very important, very complex, very intricate information, every one of these slides. And so right now I'm doing a 101. I'm trying to start from the beginning so everybody has the information needed to start building. But this is a journey. I would ask everybody that this was the beginning of your education, not the end, of course. So starting off, let's do some important distinctions. One of them is that for transgender individuals, in Sheboygan County in 2015, there was roughly 500 transgender adults because by state average, there was 0.43% of the population who are transgender. So that means that we actually have more transgender individuals in Sheboygan County than people actually think there is. When I ask people, they think there might be 40, 50 at best. There really is more than that. And there's more and more coming out every year because as people are more accepting, more understanding, more willing to express how they feel, you're finding more and more individuals are actually gender divergent, if you will. There's an important characteristics we want to point out, and one of them is this idea of sex versus gender. Gender identity is a biological thing. It's a biological sex of the mind, you have to realize, not the biological sex of the body. So quite often when we refer to sex, we're actually referring to the biological sex of the body. And so that refers to internal genitalia, external genitalia, our chromosomes, things like that. But when we talk about gender identity, this is still part of our sex, but it's the biological sex of the mind. Gender identity is something that is in our heads that pretty much is there from the start. Whether or not we have an understanding of how to incorporate it into the rest of our life, that's where the confusion does come in. But remember this, we quite often focus too hard on the biological sex of the body and not enough on the gender identity. Because do we deal with people's bodies or do we deal with people's minds? We deal with people's minds and we deal with how people interact with each other. It's not very often you go around checking people's biological sex of the body in order to understand how to interact with them. Really, there's only two people who the biological sex of the body is more important than the biological sex of the mind. And that is the doctor, if it's a doctor that deals in those parts of the body, and your intimate partner. If it's not one of those two people, you're dealing with gender identity, not sex, remember. Now, of course, that distinction, just to let everybody know, I had to modify recently because I had some discussions with some national and international transgender specialists with some meetings recently, and they told me that there's been some trouble getting legal understanding of why gender identity is sex, because we are using gender identity term instead of referring to it as still part of the biological sex. So we had to actually kind of make that distinction well known so that we can understand that it's still part of our sex. It's just a different part of our biological sex. So, gender identity versus gender expression. You quite often hear these two terms. These two terms, some people have a hard time understanding the separation, which is understanding. A cisgender individual, gender identity, gender expression is pretty much the same thing. Cisgender, I'll get to what that is in a bit. But for a transgender individual, the gender identity is not the same as the sex assigned at birth. And society is trying to pressure us to do a gender expression that is our sex assigned at birth, rather than the gender expression of what our gender identity is. Gender identity, though, is that, remember, the sex of the mind. It is a sense of being. It's a way the person feels about themselves. It's an innate level of comfort. It's basically how we feel most innately correct to deal with the rest of the gender role in society. Gender expression, though, is the thing that we present to others to give them the hint, to show them what our gender identity is and how they should deal with us. That's why gender expression is anything you can see that includes the body. Gender identity is the things you cannot see because it is the sex of the mind. It is inside us. You have to accept someone's gender identity when they tell it to you, because there's no way you will be able to confirm or deny it. The only way that we know of right now to biologically confirm someone's gender identity is do an autopsy of their brain upon death. You can find variances within the brain for a transgender individual that shows that the brain is built like the sex that their gender identity is related to. This also means that you can't change your gender identity. You can deny it, you can try and force it out of place, but you cannot change it. You can change your expression, though, which is why we focus so much on changing our gender expression to fit our gender identity instead of the old age adage of trying to do the reverse. Also remember, gender identity does not correlate with affectional or sexual orientation, which the difference between affectional and sexual orientation can be a whole training in itself again, but that's a different training for you guys. And see, I did microaggressions. Hey, all of us love using the term guys, and I still haven't broken myself of using that sometimes, but it is a term that can be microaggressive. We'll get to microaggressions later. I'm sorry for saying that. So the thing is that gender identity, a transgender individual has just as much chance of having any affectional or sexual orientation as anybody else. Myself, even though I'm a transgender female, I am also attracted to females. So I am a lesbian transgender female, which a lot of people are like, why didn't you just be a cisgender, heterosexual male then? And I would just say, because I can't make myself either one of those. I have to accept who I am if I want to be comfortable. I can't accept what others want me to be and still be comfortable with it. Also remember that understanding transgender, gender nonconforming things is rapidly evolving. There's a lot of knowledge coming up day by day, month by month. It does take a consistent updating and seeking of knowledge to stay fully up to date. I spend a lot of time digging information up in order to try and stay up to date. And I tell you, it does take a lot of work. So one of the biggest things I always stress is this thing. Most people say, Are you sure you're not making a choice? Can't you just decide to not be transgender? No. I can choose not to express it. I can choose to ignore it. I can choose to suppress it. I can choose to live in denial, anxiety, depression, whatever. But the longer I do that, the more problems I exist. I had dozens of medical and mental health problems that were alleviated from my expressing my true identity in the age of 30. So that shows you right there that no matter how hard I fought it, I can't change who I am. And once I accepted it, my problems started dissolving. So no, it's not a choice. The choice is whether or not you accept it. I also want to stress this. When we're talking about gender, we're not talking about a binary system. Binary basically means two. There's two boxes. If you have two boxes and you're sorting something, whenever you get something and you're not quite sure which box it is, you have to decide. You're like, sure, we're going with box A instead of box B. But sex is not two. It is not binary. And to give you more proof than you ever would need, all you have to look for is intersex or disorders of sexual development, or if you really want to be PC, differences of sexual development. And these are these numerous medically recognized variations. There are over 100 variations. There's actually, I think, a couple hundred. I think when I talked to my medical consultants down in Texas, they said that there was hundreds of variations, though of course only about 20 to 25 of them are survivable and able to be living a full life with it. But still, there's a lot of variations. And what did that mean if there's 20 to 25 survivable, livable variations of intersex? That means that if you add the two that we already know, there's like 24 to 26 different sexes out there. How come all the forms always have male or female as the only choices? This doesn't fit the medical knowledge we have. And it definitely doesn't fit the legal knowledge we have, though that is changing. As of August of 2020, there are 19 states that do recognize a third gender. And there are 16 countries whose governments recognize a third gender. Most of them usually use the marker of X, M, F, and X being the third one. And what that third gender marker represents is a little different by country and by state, but there is the growing trend of people recognizing that there is more than two genders. So the question is, what are you doing to prepare for that growing trend? Are you going to start just forcing the binary system despite this trend, or are we going to start incorporating that third or neutral option at the very least into the gender classifications we have in society, in the ways that we do things, the way we make policies, the way we incorporate the world? This is why you're seeing a lot more gender neutral bathrooms, because it's not as easy of a sorting game as people want it to be. Now, we already hit a few terms that you're probably like, what are we talking about? That's okay. There is tons of terms. If I wanted to, I could do the terms all day if you really wanted me to, but I put down ones that I thought were the most likely for you to come across. Transgender, gender nonconforming, that's the one we're talking about today. It can be abbreviated to TGNC, so you'll see that a lot of my slides trying to just make them smaller. But transgender is a person whose gender identity does not align with the sex assigned at birth that they had. Now remember, that's not biological sex. Your sex assigned at birth may not be the same as your biological sex. That's two separate things. Gender nonconforming is someone who does have a gender identity that does match that sex assigned at birth, but their gender expression that they are most comfortable with is not what society states they should be having. So somebody who does have a gender identity of female, but wears suits and does a lot of male societal interactions, but yet still identifies as a female, is considered a gender nonconforming individual, not necessarily a transgender individual, and not a cross-dresser. You have to be careful of these types of terms. You can offend somebody by using the wrong terms, so quite often being careful with the terms is a necessary thing. Go with the safe options, use the terms they use, and then you're most likely to get it right. Everybody has the terms meaning slightly different things too, so you'll hear variations of the same term depending on who you're talking to. Now, a cisgender person, that's usually the term used for a person whose gender identity does align with their sex assigned at birth to a reasonable degree. I really don't believe anybody's gender identity aligns with their gender expression perfectly. I think if it gets close enough, it just kind of snaps into place and people just accept the fact that the two of them are the same. But I really do think it's a sliding scale, all these pieces. So at what point is that snapping into conforming cisgender approach too much and slides into transgender? Well, it's kind of an individual's preference, I guess you can say. What is the most comfortable way to live their life? And that's kind of why we have to accept what they have to say. So we already kind of talked about gender nonconforming, gender identity, gender expression. Non-binary, that's referring to the not binary system of male and female. I sometimes would refer to myself as a non-binary female transgender because I'm a bit of a tomboy. So that basically tries to give a person the idea that even though I'm a female transgender, I don't act in stereotypically female ways all the time because I'm a bit of a non-binary female, because I have a gender non-conforming approach to my transgender female identity. Are you confused yet? I'm sure you probably are, but this is why it's confusing. It took me 40 years to understand where I am now. It's going to take another 40 years for me to continue understanding myself. This is always a journey. It's never ending in a lot of ways. Genderqueer. Genderqueer is a term that's used quite often for kind of an encompassing. Queer used to be considered a derogatory term, so you have to be careful with that term, who you're talking to. But in more modern society, quite often it's used, at least American modern. You have to be careful overseas, like Britain and places like that. It's still considered offensive. But in American modern society, we use genderqueer quite often to refer to people who are not cisgender, not gender conforming type of individuals. It can mean other things, of course. So you kind of have to, it's okay to ask someone when they say I'm genderqueer, if you're really, really wanting to know what that means and be accepting and cherishing of it, to ask them, what does that mean for you? I would like to be able to understand what you're coming from, how you see yourself. So it's okay to ask somebody to explain their term because it's going to be explained a little different per person. Gender fluid. Gender fluid is referring to that fluid state of not really staying in one place in that spectrum of your gender expression, gender identity. It kind of bounces around. Now, gender fluid took on a whole new trait for me recently when I started helping people who also had dissociative identity disorder and gender identity issues. So at first I was confused. I'm like, well, what gender would you call someone who has multiple identities? But then my consultants internationally had pointed out that you don't need to. Gender fluid is a great approach to help someone who does have that personality quirk of not really having a strong, solid identity, and these variations of identity also cause a variation of gender. So it actually fits in quite well, and that's gender fluid. But the people who are gender fluid aren't necessarily dissociating. This is just, there's a lot of people who they have a hard time understanding where they sit. And sometimes, depending on their mood, they sit differently. All of us have the different sides of our personality. Gender identity is nothing different than the extreme version of that. So that's something that you and I and everybody, we feel more masculine, we feel more feminine. As a friend once said, sometimes you want to fem it up, sometimes you want to mask it up. It's fluid. All of us have some fluidity to us. So it's very understandable if you accept that. Intersex, we've already talked about. Gender dysphoria, this is an important term to know about, also to know about the stereotypes and the prejudices that come with it. Gender dysphoria is the current diagnostic and statistical manual's definition of the mental health issue that occurs when someone's gender identity is causing them distress. Do not get this mixed up with gender identity disorder. Gender identity disorder is a debunked mental illness that describes something different. Gender dysphoria is a temporary thing. When a person stops being distressed, they stop having gender dysphoria, whereas gender identity disorder was a permanent problem. Truthfully, it still is seen as a mental illness, and gender is not a mental illness. That'd be like me saying to you, well, because you're a man, you are gender dysphoric. That because you're a man, you're mentally ill. which I'm sure there's probably a lot of women out there right now saying, yeah, that's true. But that's beside the point. What we're saying here is that just because the gender is causing you distress doesn't mean that gender is the mental illness. It's the distress of trying to figure yourself out. I'd rather refer to it as adjustment disorder because sexual orientation currently is underneath adjustment disorder, just like getting married, having someone die, moving to a new area, and all those other things that can kind of overthrow how our life feels are also classified under adjustment disorder. It's adjusting to a new understanding, idea, or change in our lives. Why can't gender dysphoria be there? Good question, and I wish it will get there in time. To kind of wrap up this idea of who we are in terms of our gender identity, gender expression, and stuff like that, I like to show the gender unicorn. Now, there's also the genderbread man and some other variations. I like the gender unicorn just because it has the 3 lines. The lines are separate. They're not a one-line continuum from A to B. It is A by itself, B by itself, C by itself, and C is a catch-all, so people can kind of write in what they want in that part. There's still the sex assigned at birth having the 3 sexes, if you will. But of course, there's 27 or 26 different variations, but you're not going to put that many dots, I guess, on this. But this is a great way of helping someone with a visualized way. I have them, when they're talking to me and they're trying to help figure it out, I have a mark on these lines where they are on every single line. It helps them understand, too, that these are separate pieces. And so there's a lot of pieces involved in who we are. When we look at the LGBTQ, it is a very complex system of lots of different parts, each independently moving, which is why there's so much variation. Because you move the sliders around a little bit and you just change the distinction in the LGBTQ world. The transition and affirmation process of a transgender or gender nonconforming individual. Some people like to say it as just a transition process or just the affirmation process. I like to use the distinction. It's kind of a more radical, more modern. It's still needing to get into mainstream, I guess. The idea of there's a transition process and an affirmation process. Transition process is what is done by the individual to be able to provide that, that comfort in themselves and that ability to express to others who they really are. That affirmation process is the reflection of what is done by those around the person to actually make them feel comfortable within who they are. Both transition and affirmation is needed for a person to be happy. Right now, we're focusing on trying to make everybody's affirming process that much better by training you. So you're half of this process. How you affirm the person will help them feel good about who they are as they transition into their new way of presenting themselves, which has been there all along. They just haven't been able to express it properly because they didn't understand it, because societal obligations made them feel required to express it differently. Anyways, I'm going off topic again. I have what I call loose shiny syndrome. Sometimes I like to wander off on side garden paths. I pull myself back if I can. So areas that are frequently focused on for transition affirmation, now you have to remember that I'm kind of boxing up things again for us to make it so that we can understand things, but there's a lot more than just trying to make 4 boxes. But we're going to make 4 boxes to make it easy to understand. Just remember, boxes are not a good way of thinking when you want to get really into it. So the different areas: personal, social, legal, medical. These are the areas I like to focus on when I'm trying to help someone and understand how they can go about on their transitional affirmational process. And remember that each person's process is different. One of the problems of documentaries is that they love to follow a very traditional transgender path. And they keep following the same path. Every documentary, every single book that you read, it's all this very specific. I knew something was wrong when I was a child, and then when I was trying to be a teenager, I was doing all these feminine things. When everybody told me to mask, you know, everybody knows who knows anything about transgender, this traditional path. But that is not the only path. That is not the transgender path. That is a transgender path. Nothing wrong with that path. But it is not the only path. I want to make sure people know that. So the personal refers to the biological body that are the things that are added to it. This doesn't mean the actual body, this means the things on it. This does include things like hair and nails and accessories hanging off of it, but also clothing, makeup, our movement patterns, the way we use our voice. It's the things we can change about our exterior self that's not under the skin to make people say, oh, I'm talking to a female individual. Or, oh, I'm talking to a non-binary individual, which, by the way, is really hard to do. If you really want to, go and try and dress non-binary, androgynous, and see how many people actually get androgynous. They're going to just pick one or the other, male, female. It gets very annoying for the non-binary individuals out there, and they have a really hard time expressing themselves because their choices are very limited because of the binary system that's in our society nowadays. Anyways. These choices for the personal are quite often the first ones that you tend to see because they're the ones that are easy to change on a day-by-day basis. They're the ones that people have most control over. They're the ones that they can experiment with as they're trying to figure it out. Now, you have to remember, experimentation is one of the ways that we figure things out. That's how we work through all of our life and how we understand everything. We basically experiment with something, see what the results are. Is this right? Is this wrong? Move on from there. That's what's happening with a person's transition or affirmational process, which means you will see variations. You will see things changing. They may add something, remove it, add it again, change it up, flip it over. That's fine. That's part of the process. That's part of that whole exploration, and that is very healthy. It can be confusing because you talk to Ed one day and Anna the next day and Annette the third. You may have a person who comes in with male clothing, then female clothing, then non-binary, back to female, now a combination, and you're getting a bit confused. If you're confused, think of how confused that person is, because they're just as confused and they're trying to figure it out with you. So it's okay to be confused together. It's a journey. That's what it is. It's a journey. All through our lives, we journey. We all have that changing of these things in other ways than gender. It's just gender's another way of changing them. Social now. Social refers to how we interact with society and how society interacts with the individual. This is a place that we have the least control over because this is how each individual will interact with us and how we interact with those individuals. It is very much the names we use, the pronouns we use, the gender segregated areas we go to, the uniforms we use, the policies we follow, and all those things. It's also, what groups are you allowed to join? What groups are you forbidden to join? What people are you allowed to go to when you say, I'm needing help with this? There is a lot of places where gender really matters. And that's kind of the sucky thing, is that you're trying to flip, but society's lagging. And so quite often you're having to make compromises and you're feeling really bad about yourself. Allowing someone to do their exploration and interaction with society to figure out where they're supposed to be will make that process smoother, less traumatic, and they're going to be more capable of becoming just as productive in society as anyone else. The more we blame them and discredit them and force them to try and go back to ways that weren't working for them, the more it's going to lag, the more problems we're going to have, and the more difficulties this person's going to have in accepting and being comfortable within themselves. Because quite often we have a choice. Do we want to be comfortable with ourselves or do we want to be comfortable in society? The ultimate utopia would be to have society be comfortable with who we are. And that's what we're working towards. But right now, the sucky thing is transgender, gender nonconforming people quite often have to make that choice. And sometimes that choice is different depending on the social interaction area they're talking about. So it does change up. Somebody might change their name or pronouns or what public restroom they use depending on where they go, trying to use the one that's most comfortable versus the one that's socially most comfortable. It is quite often very confusing for us because we're trying to navigate a system that is not wanting to interact with us. The third thing is legal. Legal refers to altering of legal records and other things like that to match the gender identity. These things are such as gender markers and names and information that are on legal documents and reported in various legal ways. Everybody who has been seeing the polls lately, some polls started actually adding in transgender or non-binary into some of their choice structures, which is really kind of nice, but oh God, why did it take them so long? It really should have been there a long time ago, because this is part of the legal just as anything else. Legal isn't just going to the courthouse and changing my name. Legal isn't just going to the DMV and getting an F versus an M on my driver's license. It's getting that recognition in the legal system also, which of course requires advocacy, it requires allies, it requires people in power. And so often us transgender individuals are not the people in power. We have very few people in power who can help us get to what we need to go to. So we need advocates who are out there, who do have the power to stand up and say, I'm willing to help you out. And legal is one of the places this is definitely needed. Now, luckily, there's lots of groups that are starting to get formed. Transgender Advocacy Center, Transgender Equality, the Equal Rights Campaign, or Human Rights Campaign, sorry. They have the equal symbol, so I screwed my name up, that name up. There's lots of them. They're not, but it's not enough. There's always need for more. So the medical refers to what everybody jumps to right away when they think of transgender people. When you see a transgender person, you're like, I wonder if they had the surgery. First off, there's not one surgery. Second off, that doesn't make us transgender. Third off, well, I'm going off a garden path again. Sorry about that. Medical procedures and processes actually are quite extensive. There's a lot of them. There's like a good 60 to 70 of them. And the ones that are most traditional that you see are hormone replacement therapy, HRT, which is when you use medications to switch the hormones that the body has inside of it, because all of our bodies are androgynous. Our bodies are capable of going feminine or masculine at any point. And to prove it, just put a different hormone in the body and see what happens. Now, of course, it doesn't erase what hormones have already done to the body, which means that the older you get, the more masculine your feminine appearance is when you do HRT, because there's already been a lot of masculine changes to your body. This also is why it's very important to have access to hormone replacement therapy at puberty ages. But a lot of people like to say, let's hold off until they're older and they understand themselves better, in quotes. Actually, that by WPATH standards is considered a harmful choice. It is not a neutral choice. And this is why, because you can't erase what hormones are doing to the body in the meantime. Now, there's also the classic of chest masculinization or feminization. There is the genital surgeries of both internal and external genitalia. Facial sculpting is a very common type of surgery. There's also head and body facial hair removal, such as laser surgery and stuff, or hair grafting to get hair back where it should be for the gender that they are looking at. These are all medical. The funny thing is that WPATH recommends a whole list of things, and insurance companies only accept a very small portion, and there's a lot of insurance companies who accept none. One of the places we need that advocacy is in those insurance companies and those medical procedures that are accessible in order to be able to affirm who we are. And WPATH, World Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare, does have an official list of what things should be accessible. And I rarely ever find that in society, because society doesn't want to offer all of that to the individual, because they're a little queasy about offering all these things to people because something might be wrong, in quotes, and they're worried about it. That's causing more damage than it is helping in all actuality. All right, let's keep going. How to become affirming. Well, remember that gender affirmation is a journey. It is very important to remember that. This is 101. This is basically kindergarten for transgender. And so you have another 12 years of education. But it is good that you're here. It's good that you're beginning to know, because if you don't know, you cause quite a bit of damage. If you know what you don't know, that means that you can start your journey and you can start mitigating some of the damage. Damage still occurs. People get misgendered, people get feel ignored or victimized and things like that. But if you're aware that you're ignorant, you can then make amends. You can then make things potentially right after you do what's wrong. And that's the great thing about the journey, is that most transgender people know that mistakes made. We make our own mistakes. I made one earlier. We aren't perfect people. We make mistakes too. What we're looking for is people to correct their mistakes, not to not make mistakes. We misgendered the dog at someone's house. The person says, no, that's a she. And we're like, oh, sorry, she looks wonderful. We can do it to the dog. Why can't we do it for a person? And that's the important idea here. If you could say the wrong thing, is he doing okay? And somebody says, no, there's she. And you say, oh, I'm sorry, is she doing okay? And then you have to do the mental process to try and minimize that to the best of your ability, which is going to take time, but it does take effort too. Now, individuals do have a right to be scared who are transgender or gender nonconforming. Why? Because they're trauma victims. They have gone through a lot already. I could list you my laundry list of trauma if you want, but again, I could probably talk for hours about it. And yet, you know, I'm still able to move on with my life and make myself a good person. Why? Because everybody has trauma in their history. I haven't found a single person who doesn't have some sort of trauma in their history. It's just this type of trauma, though, is something that keeps reoccurring. That's where the problem comes in. This trauma can't be healed from because they keep getting it. And there is a local problem. The Sheboygan County LGBTQ Alliance last year did do a survey for Sheboygan County, and we found, not surprisingly, that Sheboygan County has just as much trauma, just as much of a problem for an LGBTQ individual than anywhere else. In fact, more than the average, I guess you could say. Though we're not really bad, but we're still not even at the 50 percentile mark. So we got a ways to go, of course. There is a local problem. The thing to become affirming is to understand that problem exists and then start working on that, getting yourself up to speed, update yourself, go to trainings, interact with the LGBTQ community. One of the great research studies I've seen was that the people who rate LGBTQ people more favorably are the people who know LGBTQ individuals. The ones who rate them the least favorably are the ones who know nobody or think they know nobody who is LGBTQ. It kind of makes you see that a lot of this disfavor of LGBTQ individuals comes from scare tactics and ghost stories, that the people are just people. We are no different than any other neighbor, any other friend, any other coworker. And you just have to see us for who we are rather than who society taught you to see. That's really the big thing there. And also keep up with the LGBTQ news and movements. Make sure that it's from reliable sources. You have to be careful because there's a lot of scare tacticians out there who are trying to keep older ways of thinking going. And if anybody who's been following news knows, conversion therapy and things like that, which are old theories of how to help people, have been proven beyond the shadow of doubt to be traumatic and non-helpful, and they're illegal, immoral, and unethical for pretty much every professional who has a license. That should give you some idea right there. Of course, employee and business resource groups. Be active in them, use them, support them, encourage them. They are great places to go to for those types of information, that type of support, to help to be an advocate, to know how to be an advocate, use them. And also, please join our local support groups. The one that we created, Sheboygan County LGBTQ Alliance, we will accept anybody's help. We need as many advocates and allies as we can possibly find. If you only want to do a little bit, that's fine. We're not asking for you to jump in 2 feet and just go plowing through the day. You can be a small advocate, and that's still something. So potential issues in the workplace. We're looking at names, pronouns, human resources, medical insurance through work, gender segregated areas, microaggressions, family lifestyle equality, role models, allyship, consumer product resistance. As you can see, there's a lot of areas we could look at. Again, each one of these areas could be their own training. This is like being a pattern, isn't it? But it's still, this isn't even all the spots, I guess you can say. These are just the ones that I thought were most prominent to talk about today. So let's get started real quick. I know we're already at 3:45, so we need to keep going, of course. So I'm trying to just keep bulldozing on here. So names and pronouns, they are important. They are important because they denote a user's base level of acceptance and desire to affirm. So somebody who uses the right pronouns, you can feel safer around because you believe that they want to be affirming, even if they screw up. Even if you do get them wrong once in a while and you correct yourself, it still shows you are safer than the average person because you're willing to accept that this person has this gender identity. So what are they? The he, him, his, she, her, hers. There is they, them, there. It's becoming so common to use they, them that it's been adopted as a singular form. Well, re-adopted. It's been a singular form all its life, but it's been remade, I can't say a word once in a while, into that singular term for the modern age. And if you want to see, there is a YouTube thing about Webster's dictionary talking about that it was the 2019 word of the year, they, them, as a singular thing, because it was the most sought after information of 2019 when it comes to words. That should tell you a bit of where the movement is going in terms of gender identity and acceptance. Remember though, in order to get pronouns and names right, you have to use correspondence and conversation with and away from the person that is the correct type, even if it's not legally recognized yet. If you have to use the legal term, apologize. Tell them that you want to use it and even put it in parentheses. I mean, I don't know a legal document that gets invalidated because of parentheses, but I'm sure there is one somewhere. But all the ones that I do, I put my affirm name in the parentheses, and nobody's caused the problem yet in terms of that. So, and I've known many people who have done that. Also, if you're like, well, am I sure, can I really use that name here? Well, ask you this, if you're willing and able to call me Jim instead of James, you should be able to also call me Jane or put Jane down, because Jim is not my name. James is my name legally, in quotes. Jim is a nickname. It's not my name. And so using Jamie or Jane or Jasmine would be just as viable as Jim. Think about that one for a minute if you want. Now, human resources. Human resources, I think, should be a backbone of any company in terms of trying to lead the gender identity revolution of that company, because they're the ones who have the best in on the actual company's official behalf to be gender affirming. So I have a couple different things I usually suggest to them, and you could suggest to your HR department if they don't have these things. Can encourage them to get them. One of them is make sure that they have a line for the name that is correct, the username. Preferred name is actually starting to get kind of an outdated idea because it's not preferred, it is your name. They like to refer to the dead name as the legal name or the former legal name because it's not the name that you are. That name is dead to you, I guess you can say now. So it is kind of a slang to that. But having the name that you are, and if you have to get their legal name, have that a separate line and have that specifically labeled as legal name, because that will affirm that the person's actual name is this, even if on documents it has to be this. That is important. And don't use the legal name unless you're legally required to use the legal name. That's something that HR kind of places would have to know what they're doing then. When people are making a change at work, you don't ask for generic dates of change. You've got to be specific. When are you changing your name for the general public at work? When are you going to start wearing the uniform that is the correct one for you? Things like that. You are asking for a very specific, and you should only ask if you have a very specific need to know. If you're the supervisor of that person and you need to give them the uniform that they need to start wearing, then you need to know, when do I need to give it to you by? When are you going to start coming in with it? That way I can be affirming, and if somebody comes in and says, do you see what Josh is wearing? You can be like, that's not Josh. So it should never be the responsibility of the transgender person to educate a professional or coworker, though. That is a huge burden. It is kind of a sucky burden for anybody who's already struggling to understand themselves. You can get the information from other areas. Please get it from somewhere else, unless they want to educate you. Nothing wrong with the person educating you if they want it, but don't make them feel obligated to educate. And remember, surprise, hesitation, discomfort are little microaggressions. They cause shame, fear, hesitation, and a desire to hide for a transgender individual. Try to work on being not surprised or uncomfortable when somebody comes forward and says, I'm not a girl anymore. They never were a girl to begin with. That wording actually is microaggressive. I'm not a girl anymore means that you were a girl at some point, but you never were a girl. You just were told that you were a girl. Anyways, again, microaggressions. So continued guidance. Anybody who wants to give suggestions to the human resource, there's a couple places you can get information from. Human Rights Campaign does have a transgender inclusion into workplace toolkit for employers. The Transgender Law Center does have a model of transgender employment policies. There's other places, of course. Consultation with gender specialists are highly encouraged for policy reviews and changes, and policies should be reviewed and updated on a regular basis every 1 to 5 years is my suggestion, because if the information's 5 years out, you got to start suspecting it. 10 years out, you might as well throw it in the garbage. It's basically the way that this type of stuff kind of works. It's just evolving that quickly. Can't help it. So it's important. Now, these things I did pass on to Erin. So the things I reference in these slides, I did send copies of in case people want to see them. This slide's also with my notes is given to Erin. So if people want to look back, they can see the information. Medical and insurance. It's not as expensive as you think for somebody to cover transgender healthcare. Per member per month cost evaluation of the Wisconsin Department of Employee Trusts and Funds and the 2018 thing from Renee Walk, it is found that between 0.4% and 4% and 10 cents is the per member per month cost to include transgender healthcare in insurance policies for an insurance policy carrier. So it is not a thing where places can't afford it. It's a thing where a place doesn't want to deal with it. And that's a very important distinction, because it is a medically recognized necessary treatment. It is not cosmetic surgery. It is medically recognized and it is necessary. World Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare Standards of Care version 7, which are starting to get outdated, last updated in 2012. They're working on a 8 right now. We'll see what comes of it. But they include all these things as medically necessary things. So gender segregated areas. This is kind of a sticking point quite often. What bathroom should you use? What locker room should they choose? What sort of places should they be allowed to go into? Well, we have that problem. Remember that binary problem? Well, there's no place worse for the binary, I guess, in terms of easy to see than bathrooms and locker rooms. Where does a non-binary person change, by the way? Most places, I'm not sure. When I was still figuring myself out, I went non-binary for a while, and I went to the YMCA, and I had to change in a family one-person locker room because they don't have a locker room for a non-binary person. They just have this family one that's meant for disabled individuals, which of course is a microaggression because you're changing in the disabled locker room, in quotes, when you're not a disabled person. That's a microaggression right there. It should be, gender segregation should always be equal, even for a non-binary person. You remember that one, which is why a lot of places are going to neutral restrooms. Why do we need to separate the restrooms if we can make the restrooms safe for everybody to use? If you are separating them, are you providing what everybody needs? The men's locker room still has people who have internal, external genitalia that is not the type that people think typically that men have. So do they have sanitary napkin dispensers? Do they have disposal bins in the men's room? And this is just one kind of example of the problems that can come up. Policing gender segregated areas, though, is something that I think anybody has the ability to be an advocate in the moment. If you see someone policing a gender segregated area for someone who is transgender, gender nonconforming, speaking up is really the thing I suggest more than anything. Hey, we're not here to make a choice for this person. If this is their gender identity, they're just wanting to go to the bathroom in peace, just like everybody else who's going into this bathroom. Let them do their thing in peace. Let them change. In fact, changing locker rooms, if people are uncomfortable changing, give them privacy things, curtains, stalls, closet-like changing areas. There's plenty of ways to make it so that there's only one person seeing the naked body at one time. It can be done, it has been done, and it hopefully will be done. Again, where the non-binary people change. And what other gender segregated areas do you have, and what are the hidden problems with them? It's important. Microaggressions, you've heard me say it a few times. Microaggressions are probably the place I would point to before anything to try and give another training in before anything else, because microaggressions hurt. It's like getting stung by a mosquito. If you get it once, it's not a big deal. You get it 100 times a day and you're going to flip out on someone. It's really hard to get past microaggressions though, because people don't realize they're doing it most of the time. And how do you stop someone from doing something they don't realize they're even doing? That really kind of sucks as a transgender individual. Do I say something and make them get offensive and get them defensive and get them upset with me? Or would I just not say anything and feel bad? It's a terrible choice. There's different types of them. Micro insults, that's usually making crude, insensitive, rude, or demeaning statements that you don't even mean to. Micro assaults, where you basically are attacking the group as a whole in some way. Or micro invalidations, where you're negating or excluding that group as a whole in some way. So by saying that you're all females except for you, that's micro invalidating. By making them have a different policy for if you're transgender versus cisgender is basically being micro-invalidating. These things, it's a lifelong process. Have you already heard, I already microaggressed, what, twice, 3 times, and probably more in this speech already. I only caught 2 to 3 of them. I probably did more. And that's the thing, it's really almost impossible to get rid of, so it's more important to minimize and correct and apologize than it is to try and be perfect. We can't get away from microaggressions if we have opinions. That's one of the problems, but we can constantly try to make it better. There's lots of different ways microaggression can happen. Top down, happening from the top of the company down. That's some of the hardest ones to fix. Bottom up is what we're dealing with right now. Coworkers and people like that have the ability to microaggress from coming from bottom up, you know, the average employee, I guess you can say, rather than the people who own the company and stuff. You can have the outside in, you can have the consumers and the community making complaints and requesting that stop these things. They are inappropriate by our societal standard, in my household at least. That outside in microaggression can get to the person, and then inside out. If you don't protect your LGBT community inside the company, you are microaggressing from the inside out. You're telling the community, I'd rather not have a problem myself and let the transgender, gender nonconforming LGBTQ individual have all of the problem. Because that's really what's happening when you do an inside out microaggression. You're basically saying, I don't want to deal with it at all, so you have to deal with all of it. And that really sucks as a transgender, gender nonconforming person, because now I'm left with the full burden of how do I fix this? And how do I fix this when I'm all by myself? We need our advocates, we need our allies, and companies are a huge, huge place to be an advocate or an ally in the community. So family and lifestyle equality is important, of course. You have to accept the person's life. If I walk in with my wife, are people going to be confused? Are people going to be hesitating or questioning? Are they going to remember to include my wife as part of the significant others of the coworkers? Are they going to assume I don't have kids? I have 2 kids. I have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old wonderful daughters who are probably cisgender, and they are, everybody who meets them loves them. Yet if they come walking in, nobody would assume they're my kids because I'm transgender. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's me stereotyping again, microaggressing towards others. But still, that happens a lot. And so it's important. You have to have that family lifestyle equality, because if a person can't be comfortable, if their family can't be comfortable, how can they stay in this area? How can they work for your company? The community is just as important for the company as the company itself is. So is the healthcare in the government and the schools and social services and neighbors and law enforcement, are they doing what they should be doing in the community? And how can we advocate to get them to do better? Now, I know we're running out of time, but I want to hit this one really quick before anybody runs away. Role models and allyship is probably the biggest thing. We need role models. We need people who are higher up, who say, I am active and I am vocal about being supportive, but we really need role models who can say, I'm transgender and I'm a successful, great adult, because it's really feels really isolating if you don't have anybody to look up to. We need people to look up to. We need people who can say, this person is able to make it. That means I can make it too. And so trying to help people get to those places are very important, just as much as anybody else. So show that active, open public support. Be an advocate and try and engage in trying to help transgender people become all that they can be. And don't fall in the trap of tokenism. Look up tokenism once and you'll understand what I mean. It's not a good one. Consumer public resistance. Of course, religions have taught for quite a while that transgender is not quite correct. It's only certain religions, of course. Not all of them do that, but still. And so there's pushback from the community. We need to be willing to stand up and advocate for people for their right. We're not looking to tell somebody how they should live, so why are they telling us how we should live? And that's something that is important. I don't want to force you to have a different religion, but I don't want you to force me to have a different life. It's really that kind of thing. Remember, neutral is not a neutral stance. Neutral just means that you're allowing the transgender, gender nonconforming person to take the brunt without anybody to back them up. My suggestion, make a plan on how you will respond to these issues before the issues occur, or you're going to be caught like a deer in a headlight. Do I discriminate? And we're almost done, so let me just do this. If you want to know if you discriminate, I can pretty much assume you do. I do. Everybody does. It's just a psychological fact. If you don't believe me, there is a place you can go to take a test to find out if you have an implicit discrimination kind of thing. And the test has a lot of areas more than just transgender or sexual orientation. There's tons of different variations of this test. It's really kind of fun to take, everybody who wants to do it. So now I ran out of time, but any